Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's 1:30, so we will go ahead and get started. I am Amy Krebs, Vice President of Grants and Community Initiatives here at Stark Community Foundation, and we thank you for spending some time with us this afternoon. I am going to be turning it over to Emily Campbell in a minute or two. Emily serves as Chief Operating Officer with the Center for Community Solutions, and Emily will be discussing new Stark County data released from the American Community Survey with a special focus on child poverty and associated conditions. And before I turn it over to Emily, in terms of background and some of the focus areas of today's presentation, I think it's important to note that in 2019, Stark Community Foundation, along with the United Way and Community Solutions, released the 2019 Stark County Community Assessment. And it was findings in that report which led to the release of another paper called Protecting Stark's Future. And if you're unfamiliar with either of those documents, they're both housed on our website. But Protecting Stark's Future focuses very specifically on child poverty and at its core, breaking cycles of poverty. I should also mention, as this initiative was created, Protecting Stark's Future, along the same time, the efforts were underway and continue to be underway with the Strengthening Stark initiative. In fact, I think it might be reaching its 5-year anniversary here this fall. And Strengthening Stark, of course, focuses on economic development. So it is very intentional that both of these respective initiatives are also at the same time complementing one another. So as I turn it over to Emily, and we have data that will show that we continue, of course, to have some challenges in our community. At the same time, we recognize that there are a lot of resources in our community, a lot of great work that is already underway, and a lot of new collaborations that are forming. So with that, Emily, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. As Amy mentioned, I'm Emily Campbell with the Center for Community Solutions. Very pleased to be here with you today on this webinar to share some new data about conditions in Stark County that incorporate some of the most reliable information that we have that has been collected during the pandemic. So a couple of quick logistics. As you will notice, this is a webinar, not a Zoom meeting, which means that some of the settings are a little bit different. All participants are muted and you are unable to turn on your microphone, but please feel welcome to use both the chat and the Q&A section to ask questions. We'll have some time at the end to answer some questions and perhaps engage in a bit of discussion and conversation about some of the information that you'll see today. So please feel welcome as questions arise to put those things in there. Another question that we always get whenever we do a presentation is, will the slides be available? The answer is yes. Both the slides and a recording of this webinar will be available soon at the Stark Community Foundation website, and you see that there. And I anticipate that participants in today's webinar, as well as those who have registered but have not been able to join us, will receive that information directly in your email. So let's get started. As Amy mentioned, I am from the Center for Community Solutions. Community Solutions is a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy and research think tank. And you see our mission there on the screen. Part of our work is to take a look at community conditions and to help organizations, agencies, and governments across the state understand the conditions that may be facing the people that they are trying to serve and trying to help. We have a special focus on health and social services, and we have been delighted to partner with organizations in Stark County for several years, including the Stark Community Foundation, who is helping to bring this webinar to you today. As Amy mentioned, in 2020, we together released a report, Protecting Stark's Future, which looked at child poverty. We noticed that child poverty in Canton was extremely high and really wanted to focus on some of the social fabric of the community, recognizing that every issue that we thought was important was either a cause or consequence of child poverty. And so since releasing that report, there has been a lot of activity, some grant making initiatives that are being launched or expanded to try and address child poverty within Stark County. The information that we're going to share with you today is in some ways a little bit of an update to that report, but it doesn't follow exactly. We're going to bring some new information that perhaps you haven't seen before or heard before, and also some updated information, seeing how things have fared during the pandemic. So a note about data, and I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about the data than I often do in these kinds of presentations because 2020 was a weird year. All of the data presented today, with the exclusion of one slide, which I will show you, comes from the US Census Bureau's American Community Survey. The vast majority of the data, all the data for 2020, is from the 2016 to 2025 year estimates. What I'm presenting today is just a small amount of the information and data that's available for Stark County as a whole, as well as for each community within Stark County, every zip code across the country. And so I would encourage you, if you'd like to learn more or find something about the community that you're working in or living in, please visit the census website, data.census.gov, where you can access all of the information that the Census Bureau has collected. So we are relying on the 5-year estimates, which means that all the data that I'll present today takes into account 4 pre-pandemic years plus 2020. In a normal year, we get data for each individual year, the 1-year estimates for larger geographies, places that have at least a population of around 60,000. So we had 1-year data for Stark County, we had 1-year data for Canton. Well, 2020, there were disruptions in data collection as there were disruptions in so many other things. And the Census Bureau was not able to collect all of the information that they typically do every year. Meanwhile, the decennial census count, we're trying to count every resident of the United States, was happening. And so a lot of outreach efforts focused on that decennial census, which influences representation in Congress and lots of federal funding, rather than on the annual American Community Survey. The Census Bureau found that they had undercounted. They were not able to reach the kind of hard to reach populations, but especially low income people. And because of that, they were not confident enough in the 1-year estimates to produce the things that we're normally used to seeing for smaller geographies. For 2020, the only 1-year data we have is state, and just a small number of the tables that the Census Bureau usually provides. So we had to wait a much delayed process, but because they're grouping together 5 years of data, there's greater confidence they've been able to adjust for that undercount. And so we have the 5-year estimates for actually geographies down to the block group and able to slice and dice and look at subpopulations, as you'll see in just a moment. But all of this data carries with it margins of error. And because we're looking at groupings of years together, we don't see that many changes year over year. We never do. But even though 2020 was in many ways a watershed year, we're not going to see the impact in the data that we might ordinarily have had because we're including those 4 pre-pandemic years. And I would encourage you to interpret things with caution. We always kind of say that, but margins of error can be large for smaller geographies and for subpopulations. So basically none of the changes that you'll see today are statistically significant, at least not the year over year changes. But these are the best estimates we have. They are the gold standard of data on communities, and it enables us to look not just across the county, but also across the country to see how Stark County may be faring compared to other areas. So let's get into it. That is a lot about the data. We're going to share a lot of information about poverty, and to kind of level set, you see on your screen the official poverty income guidelines for 2022. These are updated every year. These are the guidelines upon which most benefits are based. So whether or not you qualify for Medicaid or SNAP or Head Start or many of the other benefit programs. These are the thresholds that are used. They are the same across the country, and they are solely based on family size. So whether a family of two is a single parent and a child, or if a family of two is two adults working full-time, the poverty threshold for eligibility remains the same. The Census Bureau uses a little bit different threshold for determining whether or not a family lives in poverty, but they run very close to these. The Census Bureau does take into account the age of the householder and some more information about the composition of the family. But again, the thresholds are the same across the country and across the board. At Ohio's minimum wage of $9.30 per hour, someone would need to work close to 48 hours a week just to earn enough to be above poverty for a family of three. They'd actually have to work 47.62 hours every week in order to be above poverty. And so given that, you get a sense of why we see so many working people and working families who continue to struggle and continue to be below poverty in Canton, in Stark County, and across all of Northeast Ohio, as you'll see in just a moment. Now, I mentioned that we didn't have one-year data, but what we do have shows quite a bit of promise. We are seeing some improvements. In the 2020 estimates for Ohio as a whole, child poverty hit a 20-year low, numbers that we have not seen since 1999, before the dot-com recession, before the Great Recession. This is really good news. And we are hoping that as more data is released for local communities, we'll see some of that improvement spread across communities across the state. Now, a lot happened in 2020. It was much better than we initially anticipated it would be, given what happened in March and April when the world sort of shut down to try and stop the spread of COVID-19. A lot of the reason that we believe that we see this big drop in child poverty is because of some of the government interventions that were meant to help families. They did what they were intended to do. Now, not everything counts in the official poverty calculations of household income. So we are looking at pre-tax income, meaning that the child tax credit does not count and actually was not in place until 2021. So it doesn't come into this data at all, but it does count extra unemployment insurance that a family received. It may count some of the other benefits that families receive thanks to the work of the federal government and others to try and help families make ends meet during the pandemic. So we are hopeful that as time goes by, we will see some good news in terms of poverty. And actually looking at the 5-year estimates, Canton came out fourth. A few years ago on those 1-year estimates, Canton was the worst city in the country with a population of over 60,000 for child poverty. For these 5-year 2020 estimates, Canton sits there at fourth with just under half of the children living in poverty in 2020. This is 8,443 children who lived in poverty in Canton in 2020. It's particularly concerning because more than half the children under age 5, the youngest children in Canton, were living in poverty. This shows you the 20 worst across the country for any city greater than 60,000 population. What you will notice if you take a closer look at this data is that Ohio shows up on this chart a lot. In fact, Ohio has 5 cities that are in the 20 worst, and Toledo is number 21. Northeast Ohio fares particularly poorly. Youngstown, Cleveland, and Lorain are all on the list, in addition to Canton. So we are living in a region of the country where child poverty is very high and is higher than what we see in other communities across the country. I think this is important context for us to keep in mind as we move through the rest of the data. Here we look at poverty rate over time. So you'll notice that there's a little more noise in the data for 2010 and 2011. That's because for those, we had to rely on those 1-year estimates where we see bigger swings. All the rest of the data are those 5-year estimates. And so year over year changes are really smoothed out when we take a look at that. But what you'll notice is that since the end of the Great Recession, things have stayed relatively steady. in Stark County. Again, this data is for Stark County. At the top, the red line, you see the child poverty rate, which in 2020 was 20.4%. That means 1 out of every 5 children in Stark County was living in poverty. For working age adults between the ages of 18 and 64, it's 12.7%, and the lowest poverty rates we see are for ages 65 and above at 74%. The reason that we see poverty so low for older adults is that the main government benefit program that helps older adults, Social Security, counts as income, whereas things that may help working families make ends meet or children make ends meet, things like housing assistance, Medicaid coverage, even SNAP, those don't count in the income calculations used to determine poverty. Whereas for older adults, that main program does count as income. However, we are seeing a similar trend, although not as pronounced in Stark County, that we're seeing across the state, where child poverty is getting a little better. It's inching down slightly. And poverty for older adults is increasing inch by inch, just a very little bit. We actually see it more pronounced in most communities than we do here in Stark County. And in Stark County and across the state, the younger you are, the more likely you are to live in poverty. So the last line chart showed children, working age adults, older adults. Here we've broken down some of those categories a little bit further. So all children in Stark County, almost 1/4 of children under the age of 5 were living in poverty. For 5 to 17 years, it's 19.3%. Younger adults, 18 to 34 years, the poverty rate is 17.4%. Better for working age adults, 35 to 64 at 10%, so 1 out of every 10 residents in that age group. And again, 7.4% of older adults ages 65 and older are living in poverty in Stark County. What we really want to focus in, though, is child poverty. And the data I'm about to present will be shared in a little bit different way than maybe you've seen before, because we sort of calculated it and analyzed it a little bit differently. There are 15,919 children living in poverty in Stark County. You'll recall that quite a few of those are living in Canton, and you'll see that represented graphically in just a moment. So if we take those 15,919 children who are living in poverty and show them as 100 people, they're represented as 100 people, we've broken it down a little bit so you get a sense of what children in your community may be living in poverty. First, we see their age. 38 of the children are ages 5 and younger, 36 are ages 6 to 11, and a total of 26 are teens and preteens. 12 of them are ages 12 to 14, and 14 of them are ages 15 to 17. And so what we're seeing is both in terms of poverty rate and in terms of share of children in poverty, poverty seems to be impacting families with young children to a greater extent than it is families with a little bit older children. We'll explore this data a little bit more in a moment. Here you can see their family status. So in Stark County, 15 of these children living in poverty, if they were represented by 100 people, are living in a married couple family. So both, well, perhaps not both their parents, but there are 2 adults that are in the family together. 10 of them are in a family that is headed by a father or grandfather. The technical term is male householder, no spouse present. But a whopping 73 of these children, so almost 3/4 of all children living in poverty in Stark County, are living in families that are female householder with no husband present. So think about single mothers, single grandmothers, single auntie taking care of families. And then there are 2 children who are in non-family households, which means that they have other kinds of arrangements, typically living with a non-relative or in other kinds of circumstances. We see this especially with teenagers who may have moved out, kind of be on their own, some other kinds of families. What I want you to take away from this slide, though, is that the vast majority of children that are living in poverty in Stark County are living in families that are headed by a woman with no spouse present. And you'll see this reflected a little bit more in a moment as we get into income data. When we look at race or ethnicity, we can see that most of the children who are living in poverty in Stark County are white. Now, poverty rate is different, which I'll talk about in a moment. But 58 of the children are white, 22 of them are Black. 18 of these children living in poverty are 2 or more races. 2 of these individuals are some other race, which includes Native American and American Indian, as well as a litany of other races. These 100 children also include 7 who are Hispanic or Latinx of any race. So they may be white and Hispanic, Black and Hispanic, multiracial plus Hispanic. But the Census Bureau counts Hispanic as an ethnicity, not as a race. So they sort of spread across some of these other ethnicities. Thinking about where these 100 children live, 53 of the children who are living in poverty live in Canton. 9 of them live in Massillon, 9 of them live in Alliance, 6 in Plain Township, 4 in Perry Township, and 4 in Jackson Township. The remaining 15 are spread in communities throughout Stark County. So when we think about child poverty, part of the reason that we zero in on child poverty in Canton is that that's where most of the poor children in Stark County live. And so if we're seeking to try and have the greatest impact that we can, it's important to go where people are to try and address some of those issues. So we've taken a look at what this looks like if we divide up all 15,000 children who are living into poverty into slices and how many there are in each category. But when we look at poverty rate, so the share of children of certain groups that are growing up in poverty, we see a very different story. Here we have it broken down by race. The poverty rate for non-Hispanic white children in Stark County in 2020 was just 14.4%. The poverty rate for Black and African American children was 48.5%. 2 or more races and Hispanic and Latinx children are slightly over 40%. What this means is that Black children in Stark County are close to 3.5 times as likely to be living in poverty than their non-Hispanic white peers. For Hispanic children, they're more than 2.5 times as likely to be living in poverty than their non-Hispanic white peers. We know that these racial disparities are the result of generations of racism and of negative health, social, and economic conditions facing people of color in communities in Stark County and communities across the country. We also know that growing up in poverty can have profound impacts on a child's health, well-being, economic prospects, a whole litany and host of different indicators and disparities that can grow out of growing up in poverty. And in fact, growing up in poverty is considered to be so harmful to someone's long-term well-being that it is one of the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences that have been scientifically shown to have an impact over the course of a child's entire life. So as I mentioned, we see a lot of children who are children of color who are living in poverty. We see a lot of children who are in female-headed households with no husband or no spouse present that are growing up in poverty. Poor children live in poor families. The sole way that it's determined whether or not a child is growing up in poverty is how much income their family makes and the structure of that family. And so we can't ask children to earn more to get them out of poverty. In many ways, the fastest way to reduce child poverty is to help parents earn more and to increase the resources that families have available. And that's why child poverty is so harmful. It's about a lack of resources to be able to set the child up for success later in life, to have the kind of resources to be able to address health, mental health, other issues that may arise, the kind of stress that comes with not knowing where your next meal may come from, if you're going to get to school on time, or how you're going to be able to do that. And so all of these things have impacts on children that are growing up in poverty. But child poverty right now is largely determined on the economic circumstances of families. And so we're going to shift gears a little bit to talk about some of the economic factors that we see for adults living in Stark County. And what we see is that in Stark County, there are both gender and race income gaps. So this chart shows the median earnings in the past year for individuals who worked full-time for the full year, broken down by race, ethnicity, and sex in Stark County. What this means is that we're trying to take some of the, uncertainty out of things. We're trying to look apples to apples. So these are people who worked full-time for the full year, and these are their annual earnings. We see immediately that we have a gender gap. Non-Hispanic white women in Stark County on average earned 77 cents for every dollar earned by a non-Hispanic white man. We also see a race gap. There toward the bottom, you can see that Black men earned just 58 cents for every dollar earned by a non-Hispanic white man. When you put this together, Black women on average earned just 52 cents for every dollar earned by a non-Hispanic white man in Stark County. Now, a couple things about this data. It does not look at occupation. So this is any worker who worked full-time for the full year, regardless of the occupation that they worked in or the industry that they worked in. There is a huge difference in the earnings that someone can expect to make, the wages that they can bring home, depending on what their occupation is. We know that the employment prospects that are open to people is often based on educational attainment, and that completing higher education is one of those systems which we've seen huge racial disparities for generations, and a system where we know that in the past there has certainly been the impacts of racism, trying to address it today, but it still exists today. We also know that children that grow up in poor families are less likely to attend college or university or post-secondary education, and they are less likely to finish, which influences the lifetime of prospects that they have for earnings and the occupations that may be open to them. The other thing that's important about this data is that we are looking at the median. That means that half of the workers earn more and half of them earn less. So what this means is that when we look down there at the bottom at Black women, a Black woman, half of the Black women in Stark County who worked full-time for the full year earned less than $27,500. That's less than that poverty threshold for a family of four. So if we're thinking about families, it very clearly comes down to a wage gap, to an earnings gap, to how can we find ways to increase the earnings of families right now to try and lift children out of poverty. So many of the things that we do to try and impact child poverty are looking toward the next generation to break cycles of poverty. That's so important to help children overcome their disadvantages. And in the long term, things like early education, early care and education, high quality preschool has found to have a great return on investment. As much as $17 for every $1 invested in early care and education in savings in the long term. But Stark County's children cannot wait. We cannot wait until the 4 and 5-year-olds of today are the 24 and 25-year-olds of tomorrow. And so the things that we can do right now is work with whole families to try and reduce child poverty. Another important thing to keep in mind is that having a job is no guarantee that you will be out of poverty, even if it is full-time. And in fact, 3,160 adults in Stark County worked full-time for the full year in 2020 and still did not earn enough for their families, whatever their family size, to be above poverty. So over 3,000 workers in Stark County worked full-time and were still living in poverty. Now, 2020 was a big year. We had the murder of George Floyd and sort of an awakening across the country, a light shone on racial disparities and a commitment to racial equity. We also had the COVID-19 pandemic and all of the shutdowns. I don't always like to remember what happened 2 years ago, but 2 years ago, we were all pretty much at home, locked down, trying to keep our families safe and to stop the spread of COVID-19. This is the piece of data that comes from a source other than the American Community Survey. It is unemployment rate in Stark County. The original source is the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. It comes from Fred, which is from the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank. And you see unemployment rate over time, and we're going back 30 years here. 40 years, actually, going back further than 30 years. The gray bars you see are recessions. So you can see around the year 2000, the dot-com recession. We have the Great Recession is the wider band there toward the middle, and then this little recession, the COVID recession, and the recovery. You can see that in March and April 2020, unemployment skyrocketed, it went off the charts. But very quickly, the economy recovered. And so today, unemployment is back down near record lows in Stark County. The unemployment rate in Stark County was 4.7%, not seasonally adjusted. In February 2022, the data that we have, the latest data we have available. In October, November, and December of last year of 2021, unemployment was actually lower than the pre-pandemic lows of late 2019. So unemployment has largely gone back to what it was. And we've heard all kinds of stories. I'm sure you know people who have been impacted by the Great Resignation. Businesses are struggling to hire, wages are increasing because of that. And so big changes happening in our economy overall. The point is that we had this huge spike in unemployment, but we're largely back to where we were. However, things are not entirely equal, and we're seeing some differences between different groups that are starting to emerge as we recover from the COVID crisis. Over the past 5 years, or the years from 6 years, I guess, from 2015 to 2020, the labor force participation rate has been relatively steady in Stark County. So the labor force participation rate adds together people who are employed plus people who are unemployed. So they are actively looking for work. You can see that over time, labor force participation is higher for men than it is for women in Stark County, but have stayed relatively steady. When we break things down a little bit more, looking at women in particular and female workers, we start to see some differences. And this is a place where the data is starting to highlight some of the anecdote that we're hearing in our communities. Some mothers have dropped out of the workforce. I'm a mother of 2 kids, trying to deal with childcare, trying to deal with virtual school. It's been a challenge, and I'm thankful that I have a flexible employer that has been enabled me to continue to work while dealing with all those stressors, and a committed partner that is also helping, which is something that so many mothers and parents of children in Stark County who are living with their kids living in poverty do not have. But we're seeing a trend, and a concerning trend. So this breaks down the labor force participation rate for ages 20 to 64, so the working age women in Stark County, based on whether or not they have children and the ages of those children. And let me walk you through this because it's a little bit complex. The darker blue line you see on the top with the squares is the labor force participation rate for women that have children between the ages of 6 and 17 only. So they could have 1 child, they could have 2 children, they could have 3 children. It doesn't take into account how many children, but all of their children are between the ages of 6 and 17. Their labor force participation over the course of the years that we're looking has been higher than any other group of women. The next one down, a little bit lighter blue, the triangles, is women who are either working or actively looking for work, who only have children that are under the age of 6, so 0 to 5, parents of young children, specifically mothers of young children. The gray dots there are women that have no children. So the women that are either actively working or looking for work that don't have any children, or any children under the age of 18, I should be clear. They may have children who are older. Early retirees fall into this category often, but you can see their labor force participation rate there has been largely steady. It's the gray. But look at the red line. The red line are women who have at least 1 child under the age of 6 and at least 1 child who is school age between the ages of 6 and 17. Their labor force participation was getting better, and then it begins to drop off. So in 2019, the labor force participation rate for those women who have at least a child under the age of 6 and at least a child between the ages of 6 and 17 was the same as what it had been in 2015. But we see this big drop in the 5-year estimates for 2020, one of the largest changes that we see in these 5-year estimates. And we are hearing stories through the news. You all may know people, mothers of young children who are dropping out of the workforce, disappearing from the workforce, turning back some of the progress that has been made on equalizing labor force participation and women joining the workforce over the past several decades. This is something that the Center for Community Solutions is watching very carefully. Part of the reason that we're watching it carefully is that we know there's already a gender wage gap. A lot of that, or some of that, has been attributed to the fact that women take a break from their careers or for their career advancement during the time when their children are young, and they never catch back up to their male peers who may not have done that, who sort of take a step back. Both low-income women and higher-income women, we tend to see that happen. We also know that there are lots of stressors on families with young children in terms of childcare. We still don't have a COVID vaccine that is approved for the youngest children, and no end in sight for when that may be happening. So this may return to pre-pandemic levels, but it may be the beginning of a larger trend and something which communities need to keep an eye on as we move forward. When we look at unemployment and labor force participation, we noticed an interesting trend that we wanted to bring to your attention. Here you see on the left, the labor force participation rate for both men and women, broken down by race or ethnicity. So Hispanic and Latino residents of Stark County have the highest labor force participation rate, moving on down through non-Hispanic whites, people who are 2 or more races, and individuals that are Black or African American. But there's not that much difference between the different races and ethnicities in terms of labor force participation. Where we do start to see the differences are in that unemployment rate. So as I mentioned, the unemployment rate is back down near historic lows, but unemployment is impacting certain groups of the population more than others. And we see this broken down by racial and ethnic lines. What this data shows is that 13.5% of Black workers were actively looking for work but had been unable to find a job so far. They have not yet dropped out of the labor force completely, but they were unemployed. That means that Black workers are more than 3 times as likely to be unemployed as white workers. Again, actively looking for work but haven't been able to find something that fits their family's needs quite yet. I've shared a lot of data and information. We've gone through it very quickly. In a moment, I will stop sharing my screen and turn over to the questions to see what we might be able to dig a little bit further in or what you're wondering. But I kind of wanted to end on a positive note that is a little bit different than the data that we've looked at so far. So at the Center for Community Solutions, we look at all kinds of data about communities. Today, we focused on children, families, labor force participation, earnings, just sort of a small subsection of some of the data that's available. But one of the things that we are noticing is an increase in internet connectivity that we think is a really positive thing. So we know when everything went remote 2 years ago, there were huge community efforts to get disconnected families connected with high-speed internet, especially families with children who relied on the internet for virtual schooling. And so here we have broken down by age, households with a broadband subscription and people who live in households and whether or not they have a broadband subscription. 94.3% of children under the age of 18 years in Stark County are living in a household that has a broadband internet subscription. That is a lot of people. We see those numbers well over 90% in Massillon, high in Canton as well, a little bit lower in Alliance. When we look at working age adults between the ages of 18 and 64, still the vast majority of these individuals are living in households that have at least some broadband subscription, some internet connectivity. It is lower for older adults. We've seen this for years, but what we're noticing is that a far greater share of older adults that are between the ages of 65 and 75 are connected to the internet. The oldest people in our communities continue to be less likely to be connected. But the other thing we're hearing is the importance of sharing information and being connected to services in the community online. So one of the things Community Solutions does is a lot of needs assessments, and we do quite a few surveys. We're working on several projects now looking at older adults. And every time we ask, how do people get their information? For years, the answer that we got back, the most common answer was word of mouth. Word of mouth is how older adults find out about what is available in their communities that might be able to help them. We started to see a change in about mid-2021, where instead of word of mouth, the top thing is going online and looking at the internet and doing those kinds of things. And so we wanted to share this data with you, first of all, because it's some good news, that there is better internet connectivity in your community than we've seen in the past. And the second is that it's going to require people that are providing services to shift their thinking a little bit, and perhaps where they put some of those efforts to communicate with people and to let people know about services, and also the importance of having good information about your services online and be able to do that. Okay, so I've done a lot of talking, thrown a lot of data at you. With this, I'm going to stop, head over to the Q&A and see what questions we may be able to answer. So the first question, asking if we can access these slides somewhere or if they'll be sent to the participants post-webinar. Yes, they will be able to be accessed on the Stark Community Foundation website. We will also have a recording of the webinar, so you can get my explanation of the slides as well if you are so inclined. So yes, we will have that, and it will be sent out shortly. I'm going to stop sharing here. Okay, I see another question in the chat from Rebecca. Hi, Rebecca, asking if we have a historical view of the connectivity data. Yes, we do have a historical view. When I look at the data, the numbers are higher than I would have anticipated, just sort of being in conversation with people across the community. And the biggest increases that we see are among families with children and among older adults. But we are able to look at it over time and very granular down to the block group level. So that's certainly something that we can investigate a little bit further. Pause and see if there are any other questions. Oh, I see a few more questions coming in as I juggle my screens here. Okay. Susan shares, thanks for your great analysis on child poverty. It's a huge driving force in Stark County, our pleasure. And that she appreciated the nugget regarding how older adults receive their info, a little bit outside of what we usually talk about, but glad to be able to share that. And speaking on any other trends regarding older adults, you know, there are a lot of trends happening. I mean, one of the things that we're seeing off the top of my head, SNAP and the importance that the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program is having for families that have an older adult member in their household. As many of you know, because of the pandemic public health emergency, SNAP benefits have increased. We heard an anecdotal information from one of the counties in Ohio that there will be significant cuts to the amount of money that older adults are receiving from SNAP when those pandemic benefits expire, as much as, you know, the average older adult losing 75, 80%, even higher of the amount of SNAP benefits they've been receiving over the last 2 years. So that's something in particular that Community Solutions is watching very closely, and thinking about how to address that. You know, in a lot of ways, we're moving on from the pandemic, especially from the disease of the pandemic, as vaccines are more readily available, as the disease continues to mutate and becomes a little less dangerous for most people. But we still have a lot of the emergency assistance in place. You know, SNAP is just one example. Student loan repayments continue to be paused. Those things are all going to start to be unwound over the course of the next couple months. And so those of us that work in health and social services know that there's going to be some changes that we see coming forward, and perhaps more need than what we've seen in the last couple of months or over the last year. All right, a question: are there any solutions being put in place for when these post-pandemic assistances are gone? Great question. I'm going to refer you to my colleagues on our policy team and Community Solutions, and I'm sure many of you are active in Advocates for Ohio's Future, which is a coalition. They are specifically looking at what they're calling the public health emergency unwind. So Medicaid is another thing that we expect to see some big changes here. And so please visit communitysolutions.com. I'll see if I can post something in the chat about where to get more information about that. But there's a whole coalition of people across the state that are working on just that can answer many more of those questions in much more detail than you probably ever wanted. All right, give it a few moments to see if there are any other questions. All right,
Emily, while we're waiting for more questions, I just want to quickly mention, and thank you, Emily, for your insight today and your presentation of the data. We really value our partnership with you and Community Solutions, so thank you. I want to mention that Stark Community Foundation is approaching its second year in terms of providing competitive funds around protecting Stark's future. As Emily mentioned, we have our inaugural year almost under our belt, if you will, and we are learning a lot in the first cycle, and we want to make sure that what we've learned informs this work as we all move forward. So we will look to share that feedback with you here in the coming, I would say, even weeks. We have moved our deadline to July 1st to account for today's webinar. So we're considering data, and we'll have an updated RFP, a request for proposals, posted on our website also in the coming weeks that will capture some of that information that we've learned in our first cycle with those efforts that look to break cycles of poverty. So just wanted to make mention of that.
Thank you, Amy. I do see a couple more questions that we'll run through. A question from JR. Do we have any data on the level of social services available to those experiencing poverty in Stark County relative to other communities, right? Well, that's the other side of this. And that data is harder to come by. So that is certainly something that we try to take a look at. The short answer is no, I don't have any good data right now that I can share to you about the level of social services available. But what I will say is that there are several best-in-class programs, dozens of them, in Stark County that I know Amy and the Community Foundation are very familiar with a number of them, but there are even more of them. And programs that people come from across the country to see how you are doing things in Stark. And so when I look at a community like Stark County, you have many of the things in place to be able to address these issues. It's really a matter of coordinating. And if you take a look at Protecting Stark's Future, I hope that that comes out very clearly, that you have the energy, the resources, the circumstances available to make a big difference. It's really just a matter of figuring out how to have the greatest impact with the limited resources that you do have. Kay asks if there is any data related to mental health. So there is not data in this particular data source about mental health, but that is something that we are hearing about loud and clear in every community that we're working in, is a serious concern about mental health. It's coming up on our surveys. We're seeing it especially in issues relating to children. Community Solutions right now is partnering with Akron Children's Hospital to do their community health needs assessment. We're collecting all kinds of information about circumstances impacting children and families. Stark County is included in their service area. And so later in the fall, we hope to have some really good, newly collected information about those circumstances. I think what it's going to show is that mental health, well-being, behavioral health, addiction, rising very high to the level of concern. Whenever we ask anyone in communities, be they residents, community leaders, social service providers, teachers, administrators, you name it, the number one thing that they're saying over and over again is that huge needs for mental health services in the community. So no specific data right now, but certainly a ton of anecdotal information. And as Ned Hill, formerly of the Levin College of Urban Affairs at Cleveland State University, like to say, the plural of anecdote is data. And so we know that this is a serious concern. Okay, Angel asks if there's any specific poverty information broken down by sections or census zones within the city of Canton. Yes, we have data for every census tract. And when you put that on a map, you can start to see some of those differences. So yes, that data does exist. I mean, one of the things that we have chatted about behind the scenes is putting together information maybe by neighborhood or sections of the city, as you mentioned, a geography that would be more meaningful, because we know in Ohio, cities are big and they are not a monolith. You know, there's different parts of the cities where needs may be more acute. And I know that Start Community Foundation's responses and grant making in many of these areas are neighborhood focused. So that's really important information to have. Okay. Mary asks, do you have or are you aware of any geographic data tools that can be utilized to pull information from certain geographic radius of a location? I do not. Data.census.gov does have a mapping tool where you can kind of look at it and see and kind of draw your own circle around it. But I am drawing a blank on information to look in a certain radius of a particular location. You know, all of the census data is defined by census tracts, which then put into municipalities and into counties and so on and so forth. And so you could probably take a look at the surrounding tracts, but that would be a serious analytical undertaking and difficult to do. Rebecca says Strengthening Stark has a GIS tool that may be helpful. Their GIS tool is amazing. So I hope you do take her up on that offer to provide some information, and has included the link in there. Thank you, JR.
And speaking of, I want to go back to JR's question a few minutes ago, and it's a great opportunity to mention that Start Community Foundation has a resiliency survey that's out right now. I believe we released it last week, and that's to better understand the current and projected state of nonprofits and service providers throughout Stark County. So we've had really good results early on. I think that the assessment is open for another week. So I would encourage you to participate, because that will help inform our grant making, and we'll be publishing the results of that assessment. They are anonymous, the feedback, but we'll be publicizing that in summer of this year.
Another collaboration between Community Solutions
Yes.
and Start Community Foundation. Wonderful. Well, I think we have run through the questions that have come in so far. And Amy, I am always in favor of giving people a few minutes back.
Absolutely. And thanks again, Emily, and thank all of you for your time this afternoon. We will send a follow-up email that will contain some of those elements that we've thrown out there today. And we'll certainly have the webinar slides and a recording of this for you to access as a resource. So enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Bye.